Thank you very much, Caitlin. All right, welcome to Lagoon at Noon. Like Caitlin said, my name is Mara Scadden. I am the restoration coordinator here for Marine Resources Council. And today we're going to talk about some of the research that has been ongoing on the shoreline here at MRC. All right, so just a little bit about outline for today's presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about MRC, what exactly living shoreline restoration is, and then we're going to go over the historical things that have gone on at Ted Moorhead Lagoon House and our future plans for the shoreline. Maybe. All right, so hopefully if you're here, you know that the Marine Resources Council is a 501c3 nonprofit. And we are focused on protecting and restoring the Indian River Lagoon based on sound science. And so MRC has a great historical record. We were part of getting the Indian River Lagoon listed as an estuary of importance for the National Estuary Program. We also put out an annual report card that you all know about. But today we're going to talk specifically about what's facing the Indian River Lagoon. So you should all be familiar with what's going on with the Indian River Lagoon, but for those joining on Zoom, I did want to cover it. So we do have some ongoing pollution sources in the IRL that have been occurring since the early 1900s, but we started seeing those devastating effects starting in the 1980s. And what we're seeing as those point sources are pollution from runoff, whether that be agricultural fertilizer, residential fertilizer, out-of-date waste systems, so like septic tanks, and that leads to things like harmful algal blooms or HABs. So in 2011, we tend to point to that as the turning point for our Indian River Lagoon. We had what we call the super bloom, and it was followed. So we had a cold snap that killed off a bunch of vegetation in the lagoon. A lot of seagrass died. And this led to excessive decomposition rates in the lagoon, which led to more seagrass dying off and harmful algal blooms occurring. Around that point in time, we also discovered muck. And so muck is a fine-grained organic rich sediment that we have found at the bottom of our lagoon, and that is unhealthy sediment. And unfortunately, despite the recent advances in water quality, the muck is what is still our most important problem. So muck is the source of about 45 to 49% of our nitrogen and phosphorus in the IRL. It also does not support our vegetation like seagrasses and mangroves. So we hear a lot about nitrogen and phosphorus all the time. Why is it important? So this combination of excessive nutrients has turned a historically oligotrophic system, oligotrophic meaning low plant material, low organic matter, and high oxygen, to a eutrophic system. And a eutrophic system means that we have a lot of plant decomposition and low dissolved oxygen in the environment. So when we have an oligotrophic system, we have excessive nutrients in the water column that support algae. Usually not a problem. But when we have this excessive amount of nutrients, the phytoplankton and algae really have a party and turn into a harmful algal bloom, which leads to that negative feedback loop of more seagrass dying off, less habitat for seagrass to thrive and come back, and reduced dissolved oxygen. And so this is when we see low oxygen events in the Indian River Lagoon. So this is things like the fish kills that come up on the news every once in a while. A couple of weeks ago, I responded to a fish kill on Rocky Point Road in Malabar, and this was a hypoxic event, so low or no oxygen being present. And these conditions are becoming increasingly common in the lagoon, which is an indicator of nutrient cycling. So when we have our nitrogen and phosphorus cycling through our ecosystem, the dissolved oxygen responds to that cycling by lowering. And unfortunately for our organisms that live in the Indian River Lagoon, low oxygen means that they tend to suffocate and die. So For the most part, these fish kills tend to be sessile benthic organisms that physically cannot escape a low or oxygen event. So things like our oysters, our benthic in fauna, so things that live in and on the sediments. But recently, we have seen a lot more actual fish like pufferfish and game fish being a part of these low oxygen events. And so you have to wonder, what else is going on in that situation? Because if it's just low oxygen, a fish should be able to swim away to an area that has enough oxygen for them to thrive. And so this is when we start thinking about things like harmful algal blooms. So recently, the one on Rocky Point Road in Malabar was both heat, making the oxygen lower, but we also had a pyrodinium, harmful algal bloom. And so these release a saxitoxin, which actually are fatal to fish as well. So that explains why we are seeing fish and motile organisms as well as our benthic organisms in these fish kills. But today we're going to talk about shoreline development. So as we all know, Florida is becoming more and more urbanized. Lots of people are moving here. It's a beautiful place to be. But that development leads to land use changes. So our shorelines have been, those habitats have been altered or removed and filled with dredge materials to make room for that population growth boom. And until recently, the go-to stabilization technique for shorelines was seawalls and bulkheads. And so there's lots and lots of areas around the Indian River Lagoon that have seawalls present. And that is because they are a long-term solution for flooding and storm surge. However, they are extremely expensive. You have to maintain them and repair them, replace them if they needed, and they also have some bad ecological effects. So if you have a seawall on a property, say 1,000-foot shoreline, the shorelines next to those properties will erode because that seawall is present. So we have lots of erosion around the seawall occurring. We also have things like bottom scouring, which for a restoration perspective tends to be really difficult. And I'll show you an example in just a second. But that bottom scouring leads from that gradual slope of a shoreline becoming a 90-degree angle. And that is really harsh. It eliminates the intertidal habitat for a lot of plants and organisms that utilize it. There's also no longer a natural filtration of pollution and runoff as things leach into the lagoon. It also eliminates fish and wildlife habitat and blocks migratory pathways for both plants and animals. So this is the video of what bottom scouring is, in case you haven't seen it. So as seawalls do not absorb wave energy, they dissipate it. And so that energy moves down towards the bottom and moves that sandy sediment away from the seawall. We call this a scour. And I see this often with restoration techniques failing, because when you have a seawall that's been in place for several years, the scour can get so bad that it's about a 9-foot drop from the top of the seawall to the actual sediment on the floor. So when I have homeowners that are asking to soften their shorelines a little bit with an existing seawall, it poses a challenge because of that drop off. If I wanted to go plant mature mangroves, we look for about 2 to 3 feet of depth. So when you have 9 feet of depth, it's really difficult to have mangroves establish, and that near shore community has changed. So things that usually live in a shallow intertidal community are now in a 9-foot depth, and so they don't exist. And so this brings us to living shoreline restoration. So living shoreline restoration has been around for a long time. It is a nature-based solution for shoreline erosion and tidal flooding. And there are 3 categories of living shorelines that we're going to talk about. So the first one is a natural living shoreline. Natural living shorelines are for low energy environments. They include native vegetation, clean sediment, biodegradable materials, and organic materials. Hybrid living shorelines are for our intermediate wave energy areas. So for example, our shoreline here, we consider an intermediate to a high energy shoreline. And so what's different about these shorelines is that they include things like rock structures. So whether that be breakwaters, reef balls, as well as that native vegetation and biodegradable materials. And then finally, structural living shorelines are the most armored. These are for high energy high wave energy areas, and they include things like breakwaters and revetments and groins, as well as the native vegetation. So that brings us to our shoreline here. So if you've ever been on our shoreline, it's right outside the door. There's a little staircase down to it. If you haven't seen it, I recommend going and checking it out. But we have about a 40-foot bluff right out here that leads to a relatively high energy shoreline. So when we have storm surges, our water level gets quite high. Things wash out, vegetation dies. Something interesting about our shoreline is we also have significant freshwater groundwater supply. So there's actually a freshwater cordgrass growing on our shoreline. And we weren't quite sure why, because it's in an estuarine environment, but the groundwater flux is so high that it has enough fresh water to live. However, this means things like our sessile organisms like clams and oysters don't really like it. They prefer a steady saline environment, something about 16 parts per thousand, where our shoreline fluxes from about 6 parts per thousand to 12 parts per thousand. So quite a bit of flux. The zoo actually did come out and install a clam bed for us, and we were really excited about it, but because of that fluxing salinity, it never really established and succeeded. Our shoreline is also massively shallow. So we've got about 1,000 feet of shelf that's about 18 inches deep. So you can walk out about 1,000 feet and not get past your knees, which is quite nice, but poses a challenge for restoration. It's also microtidal, and we are one of the last sandy sediment beaches that has been undeveloped in the Indian River Lagoon. So historical stabilization. So we came here, we built this building in the early 2000s. And in 2003, the city decided to armor the shoreline to enhance protection for us. And then we had a Category 3 storm, which I'll show you in just a little bit. So this was the original bluff. So on the left-hand side, we see a sandy bluff. There are some existing mangroves present, but not in high abundance so that you could say it's a mangrove fringe or forest. And then we had it armored on the right-hand side with erosion netting and coquina stone. And then Hurricane Jeanne, which is a Category 3, rolled through, and this is what happened. Yeah, so that armoring didn't quite work. It all washed away with a high storm surge. It also increased the erosion behind our boardwalk. You can see the pylons are exposed, but the mangroves are fine. So after that, after Hurricane Jeanne, we came up with a hybrid living shoreline structure for that terrace. And so we had native plantings, but we did have some human materials in place, like the geofabric that's supposed to hold the sediment in place for those plantings. And then there was some existing coquina rock on the shoreline from that armoring. And so we planted lots of native vegetation, and for the last 20 years, it's done exceedingly well. You'll notice the boardwalk is still here, so that's always good. So that's the north end of the property. So from the boardwalk down to the shell midden. But the south end of the property, Ice Lookout Point, was still unaddressed. So in 2017, my predecessor, Katie Savoya, was able to obtain a permit for us to deploy 11 50-foot sites. And this was permitted by Florida Department of Environmental Protection and Army Corps engineers. And so we started with 4 of those 11 sites being installed with a structural living shoreline. So these are coquina wave breaks. They are placed 8 feet from mean high water. And that's all it is just coquina rock to act as a energy dissipator for wave energy and wind. These are incredibly successful. They had massive sediment accretion behind them, and native plants have both naturally recruited, and we have planted native plants behind them. However, it was incredibly expensive for this project. So for 4 50-foot sites, it costs about $50,000. And so when I joined MRC in 2021, I decided that I wanted to come up with something that was feasible for the everyday homeowner to implement on their shorelines. And I don't know about you, but $50,000 is a little bit out of my budget for my own home shoreline. So this is the sediment accretion over time. So this is when the coquina wave breaks were installed a few months later. And then that was about 7 months later. So you can see we've had some really great accretion. The rest of the shoreline that we're currently working on is this way. It's accreted almost 64 centimeters of sediment, nice native vegetation recruitment and so on, but expensive. So I joined MRC in 2021. I am a biological oceanographer. Research is my way of life. And so I wanted to know what was going on in the communities when those wave breaks were installed. But we knew that those wave breaks weren't going to be a viable option for the remaining 7 sites. So I started data collection early in 2022, and that will continue at least 5 years past when the last site is deployed. And basically what we're researching is water quality, in-faunal diversity, and sediment. So for the water quality, we're looking at things like dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, salinity, depth, turbidity, to see how those conditions are fluxing on our shoreline. We are also looking at in-faunal diversity. So these are the organisms that live on and in the sandy sediment, things like mollusks and arthropods, polychaete worms. So we're looking, I go through all those sediment samples and catalog the species that are present and in what abundance. We also look at the sediment composition. So not only how much sediment is accreting over time, but the organic matter content of that sediment, how much water it holds, and then the grain size of that sediment. And because we love mangroves, I like to see them succeed. So we also monitor the plants that we plant down there, as well as the ones that naturally recruit. So for mangrove success, we look at how many are recruiting in the growing season, how many branches they have over time, make sure that they're actually growing, and the diameter of the trunk. So when looking for a low-cost alternative to those coquina wave breaks, we joined the PROS community. And PROS is plastic-free restoration of oyster shorelines. And it is run by Dr. Mark Clark and Dr. Savannah Berry from UF. And they are also part of Florida Sea Grant. And they have developed a couple different products that are plastic-free for shoreline restoration. The first is at the bottom here. This is a reef prism. You may have volunteered with me to make these, but what they are is 4 feet by 18 inches tall, jute fiber, plant fiber, coated in pH neutral concrete. And then we wrap that around a triangular form. When it sets, we stuff that prism with oyster shell as much as it can hold, and then cap off the sides. They're about 160 pounds, so they're quite heavy, but they work as wave breaks. They dissipate wave energy and protect the shoreline. The other product we started using from PROS is oyster volcanoes. That's in the top left. And those oyster volcanoes are also jute with pH neutral concrete, but they're about 18 inches tall and volcano shaped. They act as habitat for oysters and clams, as well as protecting the shoreline. And then through our participation with pros, that inspired both Katie Savoya and myself to develop what we call mangrove acres. And so what it is basically a modified oyster volcano with a seedling or young mangrove inside. And the idea behind this is that the sediment in the IRL is so unhealthy, it's fine and organic rich, that about 89% of those mangroves we plant wash out. And so we are protecting them a little bit more by adding a structure around that root ball while it establishes and grows. So in 2022, we, with a bunch of volunteer support, developed reef prisms, mangrove anchors, and oyster volcanoes to be experimentally deployed in one of our 50-foot sites on the shoreline. And so our fantastic volunteers came out every week. We made a lot of concrete and a lot of products. And one site was experimentally deployed with reef prisms, oyster volcanoes, and mangrove anchors. And then the next site over was deployed with only oyster volcanoes. So we had the support of Ideas for Us for this project. They were a fantastic group. They came out and helped us carry all those prisms down the stairs. We got a little bit inventive and used our donated kayaks to float the 160-pound prisms down to our site. And we also planted both seedling and mature mangroves. So the one in this picture here, we named her Marguerite. She's still on the shoreline, but the volunteers really enjoyed themselves moving them. And then here is the completed site. So we ended up using 34 prisms as a wave break in 2 rows to dissipate wave energy. The oyster volcanoes were placed behind the wave break as habitat for oysters. And then we had mangrove anchors and bare-rooted red mangroves planted. So it turned out really great. We were really excited. The first couple months of data collection were really promising. And then Ian and Nicole hit us. And this is what it looks like now. So what happened? Why didn't it work? So unfortunately, because of that fluxing salinity on our shoreline, we didn't have clam and oyster recruitment like we had hoped. So the idea is for these products that oysters will recruit onto the reef prisms and form a natural oyster reef. That didn't happen in our case. And so these pros products actually broke down quite quickly, and there is just oyster shell left over. So we had really significant sediment accretion behind these wave breaks until they broke down, unfortunately. We also had a really significant storm surge with Nicole that ended up destabilizing our bluff. So the bluff has all freshwater vegetation. It got sprayed with salt water so much that it died. And now all that sediment is falling down. The storm surge also flooded out the planted mangroves. So I think you can see, well, you can't see Marguerite in this photo. She's over here. But there's a dead red mangrove over there because it had been literally underwater for about a week. The whole point of these projects are to help restore or at least improve the quality of the sediment on our sites. So when we were talking about the crisis facing the lagoon, we said that the sediment is way too organic rich and very fine. Our shoreline here is odd. It is really low in organic matter because it has incredibly coarse sand. And that, we're not exactly sure why, but that coarse sand leads to the organic matter all settling down to the bottom. And so when I take my petite ponargraphs, we're only sampling the top about 4 inches of sediment. So we believe that the organic matter is settled down below those 4 inches, but those top 4 inches of sediment are really important for things like our polychaete worms and our fauna that make our sediment even healthier. And so we consider the lagoon house shoreline to have unhealthy sediment because it is really coarse, really high grain size, and has low organic matter content and low faunal abundance and diversity. So back to mangroves. Mangroves are the solution for this. Mangroves naturally accrete organic matter, and it's not detrimental because they also filter nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're not having that excessive nutrient bloom that can lead to harmful algae. Mangroves, as we all know, are incredibly important habitat. They are a habitat for about 75% of our commercially caught fish. And the Indian River Lagoon has lost 75% of its mangroves since 1950. So a big priority for us here is we have our state licensed mangrove nursery. We want to get those mangroves out on the shoreline. Mangroves are also a natural wave break. They absorb about 70 to 90% of our wave energy, and they reduce erosion on our shorelines. If mangroves were allowed to cover the entire IRL like they should, the Indian River Lagoon would not have an issue with sea level rise because mangroves are actually able to keep up with sea level rise through sediment accretion and build shorelines. Here are some of the infauna we have seen on the site. So this site, like most of the IRL, is annelid worm dominated, not surprising. They're mostly suspension and deposit feeders, and that means that they're cycling our nutrients and making sure that our water is nicely filtered. Up in the top right is a sipuncula. It's a annelid worm that deposit feeds. And then in the bottom, that's a polychaete called Aleta succinia. That one's in high concentration here. That is a suspension feeder. So we're talking about water filtration as well as organic matter nutrient recycling. So we took that all in mind to plan our next wave break structure on our shoreline. So I reached out to my colleagues at FIT, and we had a group of ocean engineering students take on this shoreline as their capstone project. And so they came up with a new wave break structure, which is pictured on the right there. And so we will be working on building these and deploying these on site in around January of 2024. But what's different about these wave breaks is that we can actually plant mangroves inside of them. So not only is the wave energy dissipated and allowed to flow through the wave break, unlike our initial reef prisms, but we can plant mangroves inside them and kind of build off that idea of the pros products. So the pros products, it was supposed to be a reef prism that formed an oyster reef. We know that oysters aren't going to recruit naturally on the shoreline, and so we want to have a mangrove fringe develop. So the wave break will act as an energy dissipation to protect the shoreline while those mangroves root and establish and create a mangrove fringe. We will also be planting white and black mangroves behind those wave breaks and planting native vegetation like Spartina cord grasses to help stabilize the sediment once it's a bit healthier. And so here is our site plan. This is actually the basis of a thesis for a master's students at FIT. And so we do have a control site. Any experimental design needs a control site, so we're not doing anything to that site. It will be empty. 3 of our sites, site 1, 2, and 3, will have that experimental wave break design deployed about 8 feet from mean high water, with red mangroves planted in and behind those structures. And then we are comparing that to sites 4, 5, and 6, which mimic a natural living shoreline. So there's not a wave break structure, there's only mangroves. So we will be comparing success rates, organic matter composition, sediment grain size composition, and infaunal diversity and abundance at all of these sites. And we hope to see that sites 1 through 3 will have nice sediment accretion like those Kachina wave breaks have that are already established on the shoreline. Eventually, we do need to stabilize all of these 6 sites. And so after data collection is complete, hopefully the wave break structures will work and we'll deploy the rest of them with those wave breaks. But living shoreline restoration is a learning process. As you can see, we've tried and learned things over the past couple of years about what does work for this specific shoreline and around the Indian River Lagoon. But the whole goal of this project is to offer private homeowners an option for shoreline restoration that is low cost. And so these wave breaks cost about $50 per 50-foot site to create, which is quite good. And so we can offer these structures once they are supported by data to homeowners as as an alternative to things like armoring via a seawall or a bulkhead. How can you get involved? So our volunteers are the backbone of our organization. We wouldn't be where we are today without our volunteers. And so we are happy to have you get involved. I run our mangrove workshops for our nursery. We have workshops every second Saturday of the month, and we go between our two locations. So here at Lagoon House and then down in Sebastian, where our big nursery is. Concrete creation workshops will be starting up in October to create these wave breaks to be deployed on the site. They're pretty enjoyable. I have a lot of fun with them. It's kind of like playing with Play-Doh, but for adults. And then our own Director of Development, Ken Parks, runs our First Friday Litter Patrol if you want to pick up some trash. And then Cara Woods in the back there runs our citizen science project called Lagoon Watch. It is a 32-year project and running to monitor the water quality in the lagoon. So please get in contact with me if you'd like to be involved. I'm always happy to help. Same with Caitlin here. But with that, I would like to say thank you and answer any questions.
Thank you, Mara. Again, if you are on Zoom and you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A and I will get to it. And if you are in our live audience, please hold up a little card and I'll come around and get them. While I'm grabbing them, I'm going to start you off with a question. You had mentioned that on hardened shorelines such as seawalls, the bordering properties experience more erosions. When you're talking about our site plan here at the Lagoon House, and you have your control, and then you have your concrete wave breaks, and then you have sites 4 through 6, would you expect more erosion on the control site in 4 through 6? Kind of mimicking a seawall?
That's a great question. If we had done a straight structure, we absolutely would see erosion on the next sites over. However, the way that we are positioning our sites is we kind of angle the outside breaks, so they're kind of winged out a little bit, and that will dissipate the wave energy so it doesn't hit the neighboring sites nearly as hard. Which should mitigate some of that erosion. Not all, but some.
All righty. So here we have a question. How long do you expect the oyster volcanoes to last? And how long do you need them to last as salt water is corrosive to cement?
Great question. So the PROS products are meant to break down over time, which is great. The volcanoes tend to last longer than our reef prisms. We have about 50 volcanoes out on site 2 right now that have stayed completely intact for the last year. They were deployed last July, whereas the reef prisms that were deployed at the same time have already completely broken down and released their oyster shell. So ideally, I can't speak quite for the PROS community, but I believe the oyster volcanoes are supposed to last about 3 years, whereas the prisms are supposed to last less than that.
All right. How long does it take for mangroves to establish and be able to withstand a storm like Nicole?
That's a great question. So I usually say if we're outside of our wet season, our stormy hurricane season, it takes about 3 months for me to be confident in a mangrove being rooted. If we plant anywhere from like April to October, I usually extend that time to about 6 months just because of increased wave action, but about 3 to 6 months for establishment.
Okay. Would the PROS tools have worked better at a different shoreline with more typical salinity?
Yes, they absolutely would. That's really the reason I think that they didn't work here. FWC has deployed those oyster volcanoes across the state in state parks, and they've been extremely successful. I know there have been sites up in Cocoa Beach that use the reef prisms, and they've also been extremely successful because they get that oyster recruitment. Our shoreline's a little bit weird because we have that groundwater fluxing. And so it should have worked and it didn't for us.
Gotcha. Have new reef prisms been tested in a wave tank?
Yes. So our ocean engineering students have done all of that testing for us. I have a complete report on the results of those wave tests and energy dissipation if you would like to see it.
Awesome. Is freshwater intrusion common throughout the lagoon?
That's a great question. I don't really know the answer to that. I know there are some areas that are like our shoreline where they have increasing freshwater flux, but I'm not sure how common that is or if it depends on the area in the lagoon.
What is a new prospective homeowner that wants to build next to the IRL required to do, if anything, before construction begins?
That's a great question. So I'm actually working with a homeowner right now who is building their house currently and their shoreline is completely invasive. It's Brazilian peppers, it's Australian pines. So they contacted an arborist who recommended that they clear cut all of that invasive vegetation. But then your shoreline is at risk. And so it depends on the path you take for stabilization. So if anything other than native plants and vegetation enters the lagoon, you do need a permit. So like for our wave breaks, we do need a Department of Environmental Protection and an Army Corps of Engineer permit for us to place those. But I'm happy to help with permitting if you need it.
She's really good at it. Not familiar with this acronym, BREC. Rick is, thank you. Say that one more time.
Brevard Republican Executive.
Okay.
Brevard Republican Executive Committee, thank you, is planning on a oyster and clam planting for the lagoon. Are they coordinating with us for best locations? And if we didn't know what that acronym says, I'm guessing they're not.
Probably partnering with the zoo, I would think. Maybe. I'm not sure.
I'll find out.
I'd be happy to help.
What is underneath the muck?
That's a really good question. So
Who knows?
there are some areas in the IRL that the muck is like 12 feet deep, which is why dredging operations are underway. So one of the sites that I monitor for my PhD is Sykes Creek. And that place is a muck pit. And so they are actively dredging it to get rid of that excess nitrogen and phosphorus. And what we found when they hit the bottom is this kind of clumpy gray clay. It doesn't have those excessive nutrients in it, so it's not, to the best of our knowledge, harmful, but it's not that natural sediment that we would expect. So it has changed. It honestly kind of looks like clay that you would make pottery out of. It's gross.
Is there a substrate that can support a biodiverse ecosystem of benthic organisms and plants with sufficient anchoring?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, there is substrate that can support a biodiverse ecosystem of benthic organisms and plants with sufficient anchoring.
I would say, so the benthic organisms really rely on the environmental conditions of the water. So it is based on whether they have enough dissolved oxygen and if the nutrients they need are present. So for the nice thing about the organisms that live here is that they're oxyconforming. So when our dissolved oxygen drops, they also drop their metabolism. So the annelid worms that we see here are not impacted by dissolved oxygen drops, which is fantastic. However, things like arthropods and mollusks are heavily impacted by dissolved oxygen dropping. So you can say that it's a healthy ecosystem with just the annelid worms, but it might not be healthy enough to support vegetation and structure. So it's complicated is my answer.
And how does your new design allow for the mangroves to grow without constricting trunk diameter?
Really good question. So the idea is that we'll only plant mangroves. If I can do my, sorry,
There you go.
I like my picture. We'll only plant mangroves in that bottom row. And so the idea is that the only part of the root system will be inside the prism, and that hopefully will enter the soil underneath it and expand. And that we won't see too much resistance with the trunk diameter. The holes are about 6 inches in diameter. And so that is a very large mangrove if they get to that point. But if we get a mangrove fringe that is healthy enough to the point that they're breaking out of that circle, then the prism should be old enough that they'll be able to break, which will be awesome.
What are these new structures made of and how much do they weigh?
Good question. I meant to break it up. So it's clean concrete. It's pH neutral cement, just like we use with the Pros products. That's all it is. There's not jute fiber in these. We use a silicone mold for it. So there's nothing environmentally impactful other than the clean concrete, which has been approved by Department of Environmental Protection. The whole goal of these prisms is that they do weigh less than those 160-pound prisms. And so they actually break apart into those little triangular segments. So there's like 27 modules in that 150-foot segment, and each module weighs about 40 pounds. So much easier to get down to the shoreline where we can then build the bigger structure. And oh, I'm sorry, they are held together with steel cable ties.
Was there seagrass before the muck in our location here?
I don't actually know. I joined MRC in 2021, but last year we did see a really big surge of rupia seagrass on the shoreline, which is great. It was present for about 3 months and then it disappeared. I don't know if it was eaten or if it was no longer healthy enough to sustain itself. But because of how nice and shallow it is, we should have an absolutely gorgeous seagrass bed out there, and we don't right now. So with improving the sediment health, hopefully that will come back naturally. We're also thinking about planting some seagrass to help it start.
These wave breaks, how long are they and when are they available for purchase?
Oh, that's a good question. They're available for purchase when I make them. So probably around November. Each module is 18 inches in length. So the bigger structure you see here is 50 feet in length because we have 3 modules long. So it's about 54 inches, 54 feet. What am I saying? Inches. Yeah, 18 inches times 3. There we go. But the nice thing about these is they're highly customizable. So we can make them bigger, we can make them smaller. The smallest we can go is 18 inches in length and 12 inches in depth.
Okay, so this question is about our segments of coquina rock that are on the south side of our shoreline. How did they hold up to Hurricanes Ian and Nicole?
Spotless. They did fantastic. Didn't even look like anything happened.
The best money can buy.
Honestly.
How many miles of shoreline does the Indian River Lagoon have? And how much of that is private property?
Oh,
could there also be an option on a government scale?
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure how much shoreline we have. I think it's like 156 miles.
Yeah, that's the length of the lagoon.
Okay, times 2 because of both sides.
What's the island plus?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely correct. I don't know. A lot of it is privately owned. I don't know the percentage of that, but most of the privately owned areas have been armored with seawalls and riprap. What was the other part of that question?
Or could these also be an option for government scale?
Yeah, so we are working on a project right now. It's very preliminary, but hopefully it'll happen. Is we're working on restoring the entire 7,000 feet of Rocky Point Road. And we are hoping to use these structures there because they are so easy to be modular. If we have a homeowner who doesn't want their shoreline to be restored, we will just skip them and go on to the next. And that is with the support of the Department of Environmental Protection, the town of Malabar, and U.S. Army Corps. So it is absolutely an option for city and local governments to use.
Excellent. And then last question that we have time for is, are there any invasive species that have entered the Indian River Lagoon due to muck?
Not that I know of. Muck is not inclusive. It kills everything. Nothing wants to live in muck. When I pulled up samples from Rocky Point during the fish kill, I went through those samples and there was not a single living organism in them, not even like a remnant of a body. So nothing lives in muck, nothing likes it, unfortunately.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mara.
Thank you.
Everyone for attending today.